Hello, everybody. Russia and Ukraine, a historical perspective. I gave a version of this talk in a public lecture to Lewes U3A in August last year. Events have moved on, of course, with Russia moving even more troops to the Ukrainian border, and with the prospect of war seemingly coming ever closer. So, Russia and Ukraine. It's a huge, multifaceted topic, of course, and I naturally won't be able to cover every aspect in great detail. I am very aware that such a topic is a potential minefield, and that national, not to say nationalist passions run very deep on both the Russian and Ukrainian sides. The aim of this talk is to place the relationship between the two countries within its historical perspective and its wider geopolitical context. I hope that that will provide a basis for informed discussion. At the end, you will be able to see a recommended reading list for further individual or group exploration. I should also like to make it clear from the start that I hold no brief whatsoever for Vladimir Putin. He's a crook in charge of a mafia state that is characterized by cronyism, nepotism, and corruption. And you will see, here's just a quote, a couple of quotes. Lenin in 1920, Russia without Ukraine is like a body without a heart. Gorbachev in 1991, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there can be no union without the Ukraine. And I've also put in a well-known quote by John Maynard Keynes: everything you say about Russia is true and false at the same time. I've just been talking about Putin as a crook and that he's in charge of a mafia state. Well, here are 3 books that will explore this topic and are of particular interest, I think, in an understanding of this man that we are dealing with, that the West has to deal with, because he's a bit of an enigma. Who is he? Can we trust him? And how far can we trust him? How volatile is he? So there's 3 very interesting books, each different in their own way. So my plan for this evening is to give you basically a history in maps from the earliest period, known as Kievan Rus, up to today. You will see, I will give you summaries of the most important dates, and I will be highlighting and expanding on particular points of interest. And towards the end, I will be focusing in particular on the Crimea and the Crimean question, which of course is so fundamental today towards an understanding or trying to understand this very complex relationship between Russia and Ukraine. If you go back to this one, I'd like to establish from the beginning certain characteristics that have determined Russian behavior and attitudes throughout their history, really, from the very first, from Kievan Rus right up to the present day. These particular points have remained germane and fundamental to an understanding of Russian foreign policy. The establishment of national identity. What does it mean to be a Russian? And in fact, that was established relatively late, towards the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. Secondly, you'll see the need to preserve and defend porous and vulnerable frontiers. And we should be dealing here in particular with the Western frontier. Where do you draw the line? Thirdly, external threats, opposition to real as well as perceived enemies. Fourthly, the need for a centralized state and recognition of the importance of unity. And finally, the significance of Orthodox Christianity to Russians as a fundamental part of the national consciousness and a kind of binding thread. I'm now going to start on a series of maps going way back. This one is probably 6th, 7th century, before the establishment of Kievan Rus. And as you can see, it's an amalgamation, a mix of many different tribes and tribal groupings. No sense of nation or national unity at all. And if we move, say, to the 7th and 8th centuries, gradually the idea of a Rus, R-U-S, began to be formed. And you can see the importance. There is Kiev, and you can see the importance of the river route, the river trading route from Scandinavia down to the Byzantine Empire. And it was within that process of the establishment of a trading route that the Rus state came to be formed. 8th, 9th centuries. And here you can see it. The Rus states came to be known as Kievan Rus or Kievan Russia. And Kievan Rus, if you just go back a moment, Kievan Rus lasted as such from the 9th centuries to the 13th century. So if I take the story forward in a series of maps. And we should be going from the 13th century right up to the present day, and you'll be able to see the main changes that have taken place within the area that I'm talking about. And I want you to concentrate on these particular points. The disappearance of Kievan Rus, the rise of the Russian Empire, the rise and fall of the Golden Horde, the story of Poland, Lithuania, the relatively late, and this is a very important point, the relatively late emergence of Ukraine itself, of the Crimea, and the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. Note the special case of the Crimea. We need to ask ourselves, and lots of people need to ask themselves, not least the Americans, to whom does the Crimea belong? And it's necessary, you need to remember that it certainly does not belong, it certainly did not belong to Russia over the centuries, as it is frequently claimed by the Russians. But then it didn't belong to Ukraine either. So here we have the situation around about the 14th century. What has happened is that Kievan Rus has been destroyed as a nation by the Golden Horde, the Mongols, under the grandson of Genghis Khan, which swept westwards. And Kievan Rus has disappeared. Kievan Rus is now part, as it were, of Poland, Lithuania. What did the Russians and the Ukrainians, or the Slavs, if you like, the Eastern Slavs, what did they do when the Golden Horde, when the Mongols swept westwards? They moved to the northeast and they established themselves around the city of Novgorod. We are talking about the 14th century now, or say around about the year 1400. Just about this time, Muscovy is beginning to form and to establish itself and to establish some sort of identity, separate identity from the Golden Horde. This map is around about the year 1500. You can see that the Golden Horde, the Mongol Empire, as it were, is beginning to diminish. Poland, Lithuania is expanding, but Russia too is expanding. So if you just go back to see what happened within 100 years, 1400, giving you a round date, 1500. And note how much Poland, Lithuania has expanded. And note also that there is, as it were, no country of Ukraine. There is the Crimean Khanate, which was part of an offshoot, as it were, of the Golden Horde, of the Mongols. 150 years later, look what's happened to the Russian Empire, and look what has happened to Poland, Lithuania. 1500, 1773. Again, no Ukraine. I'm not saying there wasn't a Ukrainian language or Ukrainian peoples. I'm saying there wasn't a state. So this is 1773. Here I have isolated the Crimea. We're talking roughly about that period, the early 18th century. And the Crimean Khanate, as part of the Golden Horde, was beginning to actually expand. Don't worry about if there's certain states that are illegible. Don't worry about that. You will see within Crimea, you will see Bakhchisarai, which I shall be coming back to, which was the ancient, which was the one of the capital towns of the Crimean Khanate. Right. So we moved on from 1773 to 1800, or actually 1830. But you'll note how much the Russian Empire has expanded within such a relatively short space of time. You'll also note that Poland, Lithuania has disappeared. Russia has, to all intents and purposes, swallowed up Poland. And the Crimean Khanate has disappeared. In fact, Catherine the Great, because of the interest in trying to take advantage of the Black Sea and the access to the Mediterranean, was determined to take over Crimea. This is the position just before the World War I. You'll notice that the name Ukraine has appeared for the first time. We're talking about 1910. And the idea of a Ukraine is beginning to establish itself, but it is within Russia. This map, number 15, shows the position just before World War II. By which time the Soviet Union has expanded not only westwards, but eastwards. And this is the position in the year 2000. Remember that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and it broke up into its separate states, independent states, including, of course, so you can see there, you can see Ukraine, you can see Belarus. With Ukraine, with the Crimea as part of Ukraine. And I'll be coming back to that. Soviet Union. So I mentioned some of the dates, but I'm just summarizing here the important dates. You'll see that Kievan Rus was founded in 882, and a very important date for Russians and for Russian Christianity was the adoption of Greek Orthodoxy in 988. In 1240, Kiev fell to the Golden Horde. Just to note that they swept westwards, of course, in 1453, the fall of Byzantium. Note particularly this 1654, this very, very important treaty, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which incorporated Ukraine into the Russian Empire. I'll be expanding a little bit on that in a minute. And then, as I've said, you'll note in 1783, the Crimea, the Crimean Khanate, was annexed by Catherine the Great because of the importance of being able to dominate the Black Sea and having access to the Mediterranean. 1853, of course, 56, the Crimean War, and then the revolutions and the Russian Civil War and the Great Famine, which I should be coming on to soon. So notice particularly the Treaty of Pereyaslav and the annexation of Crimea. And then there is the question of the Cossacks. The Cossacks were established on the lower reaches of the Dnieper River. And in the 17th century, they were a very powerful group. And what they had to decide and what they wanted to decide was whether or not they would be part of Poland, Lithuania, or Russia. And the Cossacks met and decided that they wanted to be part of Russia. A crucial date and moment. Our desires to have a sovereign and Orthodox Christian Tsar, such as your Majesty, to rule our land. If your Majesty will only attack Poland without delay, we shall be ready to serve your Majesty together with the entire Zaporozhian host. The Zaporozhian host were those below the rapids in the Cossacks group, below the rapids on the Dnieper River. As a result of that, we have the Treaty of Pereyaslav in January 1654, and the pledge of allegiance by the Cossacks. This is part of Ukraine, really, or present-day Ukraine, to the Tsar of Muscovy. Enormous consequences flowed from this treaty. Not least, it led to the Russo-Polish War and the ceding of what is now eastern Ukraine to Russia. And this is the famous painting by Ilya Repin. And it's the Zaporozhian, the title is the Zaporozhye Cossacks writing a mocking letter to the Turkish Sultan. In other words, cocking a snoop at the Turks. And there we have the theater of the Crimean War. Which, well, I'll be coming back to the importance of the Black Sea a little later. And this is a slight digression, but I think it's an important one. We have the heartland theory advanced by Halford John Mackinder, talking about the importance of Eastern Europe. Who rules Eastern Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world. And here we have it in geographical form, showing exactly what Halford Mackinder meant about it. And of course, we can see its importance today, that particular area. Insofar as the Crimean War is concerned, it showed the hostility and the rivalry, particularly between Russia and Great Britain. And here we see the bear versus the British lion. The wider conflict known as the Great Game. If you want to explore this particular conflict and rivalry during the 19th century, there's a very interesting book for you, which explores that in greater detail. Now, this is elaborating on those dates that I gave you. And this is just to emphasize the horrible circumstance of what was known as the Holodomor. The Great Famine, in which millions and millions of people, well, it's reckoned that between 2 and 4 million people suffered as a result. And it has been seen as a kind of genocide against, in particular, the Ukrainian people. And here important later dates, which, well, if you want to pick out certain things in particular, note that 1944, during the Great War of the Fatherland, the Second World War, when 200,000 Crimean Tatars were deported to Siberia and Central Asia. 1953, death of Stalin. Note 1954 in particular. We are talking about the Soviet Union, but in 1954, Khrushchev wanted, probably for internal political reasons, to make a gesture. So he gifted Crimea from Russia to the Ukrainian, from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. In those days, in those times during the Soviet Union, of course, it wasn't, or it didn't seem terribly important because it was all one country. But it had extremely important consequences. The Chernobyl disaster and 1991, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And the last date there is Putin's annexation of Crimea. Here is a map of present-day Ukraine. Well, it shows this particular map shows, of course, the Crimea as an integral part of Ukraine, which it is legally. But you will notice how close Russia is to the Crimea. And that is where, in fact, across there, from Russia to Kerch, that Putin has built his bridge. So there's now a road and I believe a railway bridge from Russia to the Crimea. Here's some statistics relating to Crimea. Yes, if the official language is Ukrainian. Within the Ukraine, but you will notice that the Russian population totals 17.3%. And I've also given you the figures for the Ukraine itself, for the Crimea itself, with Russian as a native language forming 77%. And here is an ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. You'll notice the yellows are Russian speaking, the red are predominantly Ukrainian speaking. It's very difficult to give this to give the right idea of what is actually happening. For example, within the Western Ukraine, you will find still many Russian speakers. When they recently had the program on Chernobyl, for example, I noted, which is in quite far west in Ukraine, sort of northwest of Kiev, I did notice that everybody seemed to be speaking Russian rather than Ukrainian. But it is certainly true that the further west you go, the more Ukrainian it becomes. This is map 31. It shows how far the Russians have advanced into eastern Ukraine. And it's a large area. You can see the scale. This is almost up to date, but it gives you an idea of the number of Russians who are poised, possibly, to invade, but there's no doubt that they've managed to build up over 100,000 troops. You can see the BTG is battalion tactical groups. And you can see up there, it's not just in Russia itself, but also in Belarus. I think it's worth repeating the main considerations relating to Russian and Soviet foreign policy: the security of borders, the relationship with Western Europe, the relationship with Central Asian republics, and the access to warm water seas. So when you ask yourselves, well, what is Putin worried about? This is what he's worried about. This is what concerns the Kremlin. It's these points that concern the Kremlin. And just to rub home the point of the importance of the Black Sea for Russians, and access, this very, very narrow access, of course, to the Mediterranean. Just a few slides now to emphasize the importance of parts of the Crimea for Russians and Russian cultural history and Russian sensibility. This is the fountain of Bakhchisarai, which was the old capital of the Crimean Khanate. And there's many Russians will know by heart a famous poem by Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin, Bakhchisaraysky Fontan, the fountain of Bakhchisarai. This is another site of importance to Russians in the Crimea, and it is the house where Anton Chekhov lived and in the last few years of his life. Bielaya Dacha, the White Dacha. This is the Livadia Palace, which belonged to the Tsars on the Crimean coast. This is known as the Swallow's Nest, a favorite resort, holiday resort. And this, of course, is a photograph of the Yalta Conference in February 1945, when the future of Europe was decided. Here we have Putin inspecting the Black Sea fleet. I think in 2018. And finally, well, not quite finally, I will give you further reading. I mean, there's masses and masses and masses of books, so it was difficult to pick some, but these are some of my favorites. If I wanted to pick one, well, one general one, Philip Longworth is extremely interesting on Russia's empires, their rise and fall from prehistory to Putin. On the Ukraine, I thoroughly recommend Anna Reid, Borderland, A Journey Through the History of Ukraine. yeah, Sergei Plochy, who I think is at Harvard, or he's an American university, has written a number of books on Ukraine, a very interesting one on Chernobyl. Yeah, notice the third one there, Nikolai Tolstoy, Victims of Yalta. And this is well, it's a very sad story, really, because Tolstoy writes about those Ukrainians, and there were quite a number, who when the Germans invaded Ukraine in 1941, there were a number of Ukrainians, certainly not the majority. I want to stress that, certainly not the majority of Ukrainians, but there were a number of Ukrainians who decided they'd throw in their lot with the German army. And Nikolai Tolstoy writes about their fate, basically, because when the Germans lost the war in 1945, there were large numbers of Ukrainians who were captured as part of the German army. And at Yalta, Stalin insisted that they should be returned from prisoner of war camps in Britain, for example. They had to be, as part of the Treaty of Yalta, they had to be returned to Russia, whereas, of course, they suffered a horrible fate. And you'll notice also the book by Brian Glynn Williams, The Crimean Tatars, From Soviet Genocide to Putin's Conquest. I just put this in because it's what the Soviet Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in January 21. This is our land and these are our waters. Everything that our country is doing there is absolutely legal and legitimate. What's he referring to? Well, he could be referring to the Crimea. He could be referring to the Far East. He could be referring to the Baltic. But in fact, and this is something to bear in mind to watch for the future, in fact, he's talking about the Arctic. So Russia is absolutely determined to establish itself, if you like, to become great again. And I would just leave you with a final picture of the beautiful city of Kiev, where it all began. If you get the chance, go to Kiev. If you haven't been, go to Kiev, and particularly in May, when it's blossom time is extraordinary, and you have the beautiful river Dnieper there. So I hope I have helped to shed light on a very complex relationship at an extremely fraught moment in European history. If I were a betting man, I would still say the odds are on Putin deciding not to mount an at least full-scale invasion. But I don't have a crystal ball, of course, and I could be wrong. The pressures on Putin, internal as well as external, are enormous. Factors such as the need to contain Belarus within the Russian orbit and the burgeoning relationship with China, which we've just seen, haven't we, at the opening of the Winter Olympics, have to be taken into consideration. Remember, too, that Putin regards the breakup of the Soviet Union as, quote, the demise of historical Russia and, quote, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. It would be a huge mistake on the West's part to underestimate the political, geopolitical, economic, demographic, and psychological consequences of such an event, the breakup of the Soviet Union. Putin could therefore take a gamble and decide that not to invade would be a worse option, or would be his worst option. So let us hope and pray that common sense on both sides will prevail. Thank you very much.